This is the McKinsey podcast, where we help you make sense out of our world's toughest business challenges.
Welcome to the show. I'm Lucia Rahili.
And I'm Roberta Fasaro.
I think retailers and consumer product companies should not forget that they've had this long-standing relationship with their consumers, and the consumers have told these companies a lot about themselves. The question is, can you harness that to actually tailor your offerings and engaging with these consumers in a different way?
That's McKinsey senior partner Sajal Kohli. So what's a business to do when today's shoppers are behaving in unexpected ways? Sajal's here to share some McKinsey research that can help companies make sense of these surprising consumer moves.
In our second segment, the most powerful storytellers in your organization are your employees, so long as you can rally them around the narrative. McKinsey senior partner Joydeep Sengupta fills us in.
Sajal, thanks so much for joining the podcast today.
My pleasure, Roberta. Thank you for having me.
This year's State of the Consumer report reveals some compelling data points on who is spending, what they're buying, and where they're buying. We should start with the who. Changing demographics are clearly affecting the state of consumer spending. So, Sajal, who are the spenders of the future?
We are seeing large-scale shifts in the global consumer landscape currently. And the consumers are just continuing to, and much more today, defying expectations and just behaving in very, very different ways, in sort of very atypical ways. And it's keeping consumer goods companies and retailers and consumer-facing businesses really on their toes, right? Who is the future consumer? And maybe I'll talk about maybe the first and very exciting group, the young people in emerging markets. By 2030, about 75% of consumers in emerging markets will be between the ages of 15 and 34. That's a pretty startling statistic if you kind of think about where all the discretionary spend will be. So for example, with all my global travels, if you look at Asia and Middle East, they will be particularly important in the 18 to 24 age group for consumer-facing companies. And these consumers are exhibiting all kinds of really, really interesting behaviors.
What are the differences in behaviors that you're seeing in that particular part of the world?
They're showing a very high willingness to spend. The younger consumer and the age group that I gave you are about 2 times more likely to trade up in terms of more premium products across brands and retailers versus their peers in different parts of the world. And frankly, this comes from the fact that they're more optimistic about the economy versus their Western peers, right?
I called them idealistic because, youth is wasted on the young. But please continue regarding the other set of demographics.
So that's clearly one. I think the second one that I wanted to talk about is the other bookend of the spectrum. We just talked about the young, the idealistic, to use your words. The other bookend is the folks who I think I would call retired and ready to spend, which is also a group that's sort of often overlooked. Listen, the facts are super clear. With longer life expectancy, declining birth rates, especially in advanced, more developed economies, all these economies are going to deal with global population bulge of people older than 65, and it's growing really fast. The data and the consumer behavior and preferences of this group are often sort of overlooked or misunderstood. So just to give you a couple of examples, the higher income baby boomer, or what I call the silent generation of consumers, think about folks who have household income of over $100,000. They're a pretty sizable cohort in the US. It's about 30% of the US economy, right, in terms of purchasing power and spending power. And this group is very focused on spending disproportionately in experiential categories. Think about travel, right? Things that has more to do with experience versus just consumption of goods, right? So more services than goods. Now you might say, hey, listen, this is frankly a manifestation or an expression of the affluent in more developed markets, but it's actually true in emerging markets as well. So wealthy, aging consumers in emerging markets are also very, very optimistic. So give you a very stark contrast, right? 40% plus of wealthy aging consumers in emerging markets basically said to us that they're expecting to spend much more on entertainment compared to only 7% of comparable consumers in Europe and 11% in the US, right? So the center of gravity of this cohort is actually shifting quite massively.
Right.
So
Right.
that's sort of cohort or segment two in terms of, growth opportunities. The third one is to sort of take my metaphor of the bookends. Right down the middle is what I would call the squeezed but splurging middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And the cost of living is up everywhere, right? Doesn't matter which inflation index or which sort of economy index metric you look at. This cost of living is going up across economies, both advanced and emerging. And conventional wisdom would suggest that these folks would really clamp down on discretionary spending, things that are not necessities or amenities or staples. But instead, what we are seeing is that the middle income consumer in, for example, the US and Europe, have huge and pretty magnified intent, and they plan to splurge on discretionary items at a rate that's pretty comparable to high income consumers. So this group in itself, they're looking at travel, they're looking at dining out, again, experiential. So they're also being quite a bit more thoughtful and cautious, but also much more sort of leaning into spending things that really enhance their quality of life.
It's great. So, Sajal, it's interesting because across all three of these cohorts of consumer, you mentioned the word optimism several times. And I guess I would have expected that with all the recent talk about economic downturn and inflation, that we would be hearing about more of a conservative spending story. But that's not happening. So are there lessons here that we can draw about consumer confidence more generally?
Yeah, I know. Obviously, it depends by consumer cohort and stage of life and preferences, obviously, and by different geographies. But I think in general, I would say the consumers have gotten, the word that comes to mind is discerning. They're
Okay.
being incredibly thoughtful and purposeful about where they do not want to spend versus where they want to spend. Value for money is still going to be the centerpiece of their spending habits and decisions that they actually make. But that's going to be much more contained to regular day-to-day amenities, groceries, staples, etc. But when it comes to enhancing their quality of life and indulging in more experiences or discretionary spend categories, think about beauty as an example, or personal care, you're actually going to see a much higher intent to spend much more versus historical levels. So it's a much more discerning consumer that's really deciding where they want to spend, when they want to spend, and who they want to spend with.
So you've led me to the next question that I had. We've talked a little bit about who is spending, but Sajal, what are they buying? For instance, I've heard lots about brand loyalty and the impact of the pandemic. Is brand loyalty still a thing? Are more people brand hopping?
Just to step back to answer your question a little bit more sort of, overarchingly,
Right.
what do consumers really want? So the reality, we have to just ground ourselves in the reality that in general, compared to previous times, we are seeing weakened brand loyalty. Consumers are putting affordability over sustainability. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. And there's a heightened interest in wellness products and services.
Mm-hmm.
When you combine these three forces, you see a very different reflection, the consumer reflection and expression in what their preferences and priorities are going to be. So let's talk about brand exploration for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So the pandemic had a pretty material and seismic shift where when consumers couldn't really find what they were looking for because of availability, etc., we saw some pretty interesting switching behavior just through the pandemic and even post. And the interesting thing is a lot of these behaviors have actually stuck. Switching brands, switching channels, exploring alternatives. I call it promiscuity. Might not be a great word, but they're really trying to explore. And
Right.
just to give you an example, in more developed markets, think about the Western Hemisphere. Over a third of the consumers have tried different brands, and approximately 40% of consumers have switched retailers or added new retailers to their sort of weekly, monthly rhythm. That is pretty unprecedented in terms of the choices that the consumer is actually making. And then the other important thing is this behavior is not contained in any one cohort. So brand weakening of brand loyalty is not just limited to any specific age group. In the past, we would always say that the stereotypical thing to do or to say was that the older aging consumer is very loyal and consistent with their preferred brands. We're seeing pretty high propensity to try new things in this group as well. And an important outcome of this weakened brand loyalty and the consumer's brand exploration has really given some tailwinds to the increased penetration of private brands. About 35% of consumers still plan to purchase private label products more frequently. And quite startlingly, 60% of consumers think that private brands are of the same, equal, or better quality than branded products. We saw that, frankly, in Europe quite a lot historically. We can see clear evidence of that in the US. We can see it in Latin America. And I was speaking to this retailer in Brazil about a week ago, and they have the same issue. They are seeing some double-digit penetration in private label across multiple formats, right? And just it's been a huge area of growth for them. You see this in Southeast Asia. If you look at the Vietnam, Cambodia corridor, in Singapore, which is a pretty developed Asian market and high income, from a per capita GDP perspective, is also seeing some incredible run up in private label penetration.
And this is happening across all categories, or are we seeing, kind of winners emerge in specific categories?
I mean, it's across the board, right? If you look at apparel, which is a discretionary spending category, right, you're seeing lots of penetration in private label apparel. When you look at department stores around the world or specialty mall-based retailers, you're definitely seeing it in the food category. If you go to a grocery aisle, you'll see retailers who have gotten quite sophisticated in terms of a 3-tier private label strategy, a good, better, best. We are seeing it in beauty products. So it's actually pretty pervasive right now.
According to the report, sustainability is also playing a central role in consumer purchasing decisions. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on there and what we saw in the research?
It's a mixed bag right now. So if you go back 3 or 4 years, even pre-pandemic, and every time we would do research and you look at any sort of consumer preference or behavior readout, you'd see sustainability up there, right? If you look at the top 6 or 7 criteria that the consumer really cared about. I think when you really look at the reality of what they're really doing, I think it's a case of value upstaging values, which means value for money is still far more important than the values of sustainability and being environmentally friendly. And to point out a very stark example, in the past, the younger generations would always vote with their feet, which is I really care about the environment, I care about sustainability. When you look at the data now, they are the first group to walk away from that claim when it comes to paying some sort of a premium for sustainability and environment-friendly product or services. Now, this changes quite dramatically as you look across geographies. I think Europe is still setting the pace. Like when I talk to retailers and consumer goods companies in Europe, this is top 3 item on a CEO's agenda.
Mm-hmm.
When you switch to the US or you look at Latin America or even large parts of Asia, this is not at the top of their priority list. And they're largely reacting to the consumer's choice and consumer behavior. So I still think this is a work in progress. There is no definitive trend that we are seeing. It's a mosaic of mixed experiences around the world. So we'll see.
That makes sense. So another spending trend among global consumers is in the area of wellness. And maybe there's some, I don't know if there's some connection here between wellness products and sustainability, but we've talked about the wellness and the trends in this area on this podcast before. I'm just curious, what is motivating this groundswell of interest in the wellness space, particularly among women, it seems?
We are seeing this actually across the globe, and I'll give you a few examples. This is a very different story. It's the tale of two cities. We talked about sustainability, sort of mixed record. But when you look at wellness, it couldn't be more clear that this area is going to be a winner. And it's largely first and initially being buoyed by the boomer market, the aging population, right? Just given expectancy of life, people are retiring, much later. And McKinsey just published a report called the Consumer Health Report. And the global wellness market is about 1.8 trillion and actually growing 5 to 10% annually, right? This to me is massively understated. Now, this wellness trend, you would say this might actually be a luxury of the rich, right? When you have enough disposable income, you can talk about wellness, so the Western world or the more developed world. But we are seeing 50% of the world's population is going to be overweight or obese by 2035. we're actually seeing this wellness trend catch real fire actually also in emerging markets, right? So just to give you an example, in India and China and actually also the Middle East have indicated that there's 2 times more interest in increasing their spending on fitness and wellness services versus advanced countries. Give you another fact: 60% of the boomers in China clearly plan to increase their spend on fitness, right? And wellness is not just fitness, it's got many categories. It's got sleep as an example under it, it's got nutrition, it's got experiences. So I think we have to think about challenging the paradigms of how we thought about wellness in the past into a much more broader ecosystem of consumer spending areas.
Hmm. Are there any examples of kind of cool, innovative wellness products that you've heard about or that clients are
Yeah.
talking about?
We've seen a surge in vitamin and supplement consumption. People are looking at the home category to enhance quality of sleep in a very different way. So I think there's several examples, and we are seeing this across large cap leading CPG and retail companies, and we are seeing a ton of metabolic rate around this in the startup world as well, right? So it's actually across the board.
We've spoken about that on the podcast before. I could imagine that a lot of older consumers would be thinking about my health as you get older and things are slowing down or whatever. But the fact that this goes across the board, and there are a lot of younger consumers who also care about wellness products.
Absolutely, and I think at the epicenter of this entire what I call the wellness wave, and we say in the report, is actually the wellness for women. And I was at Davos earlier this year, and we just published a report on women's health. Our estimation is that just closing the women's health gap could be worth $1 trillion opportunity annually by 2040. So it's a underserved, under-addressed area. And once again, it's pervasive across all different hemispheres and all different parts of the world. To give you an example, a very high percentage of women in emerging markets, almost 50%, demonstrate very high intent to splurge on beauty and personal care products, compared to women in much more advanced markets. And the younger women cohort is particularly interested in wellness. Like if you look at Gen Z in both emerging and advanced markets, huge propensity to spend and consume these services going forward. So I think there's a real sort of call to action for consumer product companies that play in that space.
And we'll talk a little bit more about the implications of all these data for companies. But let me backtrack just for a sec. So now that we have a sense of who is buying what, maybe we should talk a little bit about where consumer spending is occurring. What did the State of Consumers report suggest about site-specific purchasing, or where and how purchases are happening?
I won't talk a lot about what we already know, which is, both bricks and mortar and e-commerce or omni-channel avenues are still going to be quite prolific. But there are two that I want to highlight that are really standing out, and I think these could be the opportunities of the future. The first one is the new urban hotspots. But maybe 2 or 3 very interesting insights on this. If you look at the US, there's a lot of growth that's coming in the top 13 or 14 cities in terms of consumption growth. Take the Pacific Northwest and the Northeast for a second, but there are a whole bunch of, I would call, secondary cities with populations of 50,000 to 500,000, which are also really emerging as the next growth frontier. If you contrast that, from the US to China, a big chunk of the growth, if you look at the last couple of decades, was in the big cities, the tier 1 cities. We are now seeing equivalent or higher growth rates in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. Think about the Kuala Lumpur, New Delhi, Mumbai, Sao Paulo. It's actually going into the secondary cities where there's a huge opportunity. And they're not rural at all, right? These are actual real urban centers. In 2035, 43% of the Indian population is going to live in urban areas. It's a pretty important pivot and a pretty seminal and secular trend that creates lots of opportunities to serve these consumers. The whole trend on social commerce. I think we're at a tipping point where a lot of trends and consumer behavior from the East is going to travel to the West, and social commerce is a perfect example. So in India and China, 40 or 45% of the consumers are actively engaged in social commerce. And I think it's just a matter of time, before it takes root in the Western world.
Can you share an example or two of companies that are finding success with social commerce?
There's an example of a retailer in Brazil that's actually created some very interesting social commerce avenues where some of their most loyal customers will get a bunch of friends together and buy together as a group and share a set of products and services, right? Which is giving them incredible, secondary city and rural and urban penetration, which is a really interesting example. I think if you look at India, the number of folks who are actually going to online marketplaces for things that were pretty high search categories and high involvement categories where people are just sort of engaging in them online and through social commerce platforms is, yet another example. And so to me, this is a untapped territory of opportunity especially in the developed world, if I think about Europe and the US.
Are there any early examples in the West of this sort of social commerce?
I mean, there is, it's still tough. I mean, if you go back to Home Shopping Network, and linear TV, those were the beginnings of it, right? But it's not expanded into multiple alternate formats and platforms yet.
What should listeners and readers of the report, what can and what should they do with all these great data? What are some of the lessons for companies that are looking to deepen their connections with consumers?
As folks read the report, and I hope they do, everybody, given their context, is going to, draw different insights. But from my perspective, there might be 3 or 4 that are worth really, really confronting and debating as management teams. The first one is, it's patently obvious to us from the research and the work that we've been doing that we are in a world of micro-targeting and hyper-personalization. And so the era of the tyranny of averages is over. This is actually all about granularity and hyper-personalization. And to pull that off, it's all about data and advanced capabilities in organizations to really understand these consumers at an individual or a small or a micro segment level. And I think that ought to be an important area of investment as organizations look at these sets of opportunities that we were talking about.
Are there any best practices in micro-targeting that you're seeing?
We have an approach that we use with a lot of our clients called Smart Reach. That's a very advanced analytics technique. There's a lot of promise in AI and Gen AI. It's not completely mature yet, but there's real room for experimentation. And I think, retailers and consumer product companies should not forget that they've had this long-standing relationship with their consumers, and the consumers have told these companies a lot about themselves. The question is, can you harness that to actually tailor your offerings, and engaging with these consumers in a different way? And that's maybe focus area 1. I think focus area 2 for me would be, we talked about wellness writ large, but also for women. I think it's important for businesses and companies, retailers, CPG companies, and other consumer-facing businesses to really step back and say, if I look at my business and I approach it from what am I doing in my core business, what else can I do in anything adjacent to my business? Can I birth new businesses? As they think about those moves, they should have wellness up front and center and say, what would their interpretation be in terms of playing in the wellness market? The third one for me is, we talked about physical meets digital, and my only variation on this would be social meets digital, like we were talking about social commerce.
Right.
This is a good place to start investing in. And a big part of this will actually mean thinking about inorganic moves quite differently. And I don't mean inorganic just with these stereotypical acquisitions, but partnerships you wouldn't have envisioned before, where the combined benefits of your business and a partner who brings something incremental could open up a fantastic opportunity for both companies to serve the customer better. Just imagine a financial services company that has fantastic insights into consumer because of credit card data, partnering with the retailer as a second partner who has, third party data, then partnering as a 3-way partnership with a consumer products company that has first party data. Yeah. You add all these 3 and you get a 360-degree view of the consumer in terms of how you think about social and digital, just to bring an example to life.
I can imagine lots of different applications or ecosystems that develop across different sort of consumer organizations.
Yeah. And maybe the last one I'll highlight is premiumization. While there's very clear signals from the consumer that value for money is important. There's also real opportunity to go down the premiumization route, where consumers are looking for the brands that they trust for enhanced experiences, higher quality products. They are willing to pay a premium, which basically means that you can't have a one size fit all strategy. That retailers and consumer product companies have to really open up the aperture and think about different pricing strategies, different product portfolio, category portfolio strategies. And the reason is having premiumization at the heart of your strategic moves. Actually, apart from just it's a much better financial picture for the business, it also actually caters and it starts to address consumer needs in a much more sophisticated way versus just going down the value for money route. Now,
Right.
this will change by category, so you have to really think about the context of your business and the different categories, but this would be the fourth area that I would highlight.
What surprised you most about the research, or what are some of the trends that you saw that maybe you're most passionate about or looking forward to exploring more?
I think to me, the consumer defying our expectations was actually a pretty eye-opening set of trends. It puts a very heavy premium on depth of capabilities and sophistication of how you go to market, right? It needs to be much more evolved, and what's worked in the past will most definitely not work in the future. And there is some real opportunity of cross fertilization. And I mean that at two fronts. One is learning from markets that you are not in today. And the second is taking some of your successful recipes and porting them over into markets and categories and consumer cohorts where it'll actually work. So I think this whole idea of not being a prisoner of your context.
I love that. I love that. One of the notes that I have jotted down, Sajal, is this idea of kind of innovative ideas and things around social commerce, for instance, are coming from the East.
So it's the east-west corridor and it's a north-south corridor. I'll give you a very interesting example, which is, I was leading a forum with some CEOs in Latin America, and they basically said, we live with volatility every day. We think volatility is a friend because it creates opportunities, whether it's, macroeconomic, indices or all kinds of issues that have created the volatility, that it's quite instructive for the more developed, more stable economies to also learn from that.
I'm going to pull a Barbara Walters type of question out and ask you to fill in the sentence, a one-word adjective to this following sentence. The state of the consumer is?
Can I take the liberty of just twisting it a bit?
Sure.
Maybe I'll say the state of mind of the consumer is optimistic, but unequivocally more discerning.
Thank you so much, Sajal. This has been a great conversation. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you, Roberta. I really appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Next up, the best way to radiate your company's story is through employees that can get behind the narrative. Here's managing producer Laurel Moglen with McKinsey senior partner Joydeep Singh Gupta.
Joydeep, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
What would you say the best CEOs do to make sure their team understands the company's story really, really well?
One of the things I've observed is that typically people like to rally the organization around one big theme. It could be one idea, it could be an audacious goal. And once you have that idea in place, I think the question is around how do you translate that into a simple story? So typically, what is the values? What is the strategy? What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? And more importantly, what you're not going to do. And the final thing I would say in that context is that typically when you do something like this, you do it together, right? You don't do it on your own. And many organizations which have been successful in CEOs in particular try to take the top team, sometimes even the entire organization together to try and build this placemat of the story.
How do CEOs prepare their employees to share the story, both internally and externally?
It's really an art, storytelling. CEOs pay a lot of attention to how they tell the story, and people use different approaches. I go back to an example which I remember from 10 years ago when State Bank of India was going through a massive transformation. And the CEO then, to communicate the story, used a movie. It was called The Legend of Bagavans, in which a golfer had lost his swing and essentially was trying to gain it back. And he used the movie as a metaphor for the organization and what is it that they would have to do. And that movie went viral because he used that single movie over 2-day workshops, communicating to employees, etc., etc. The other thing which I found is that many CEOs actually use storytelling as a way to create collaborativeness and build inclusiveness in the organization. Storytelling is such an important aspect of how you really build energy and excitement. And I think most CEOs think about this as a real science in terms of how they design and plan for it. And I would use what I would call the 4-5-6 of storytelling. High performing organizations are 4 times more likely to dedicate resources to communication, 5 times more successful if you get your employees to participate in that process of providing input, and 6 times more successful if you're really able to cascade this all the way through the employees, not by yourself. Those companies where lots of employees are engaged in talking about their strategy and their story, both internally and externally.
How important is it for CEOs to role model the behavior that they are asking their employees to emulate?
It's really important. Our research shows that 86% of CEOs who believe that they are acting as a role model for such inclusive behavior. When you talk to their employees, actually only 50% or so say that they are actually watching the CEO do that. So there is a real disconnect. And I think the disconnect is largely because when you think about self-awareness and you think about what it takes to give up, quote unquote, your powers. So very often CEOs invest a lot of time in developing the strategy, the approach, the story, and they want to be in the limelight telling the story. And the fact that in the creation of that story, they may have to compromise their own personal point of view because they have to incorporate inputs from the rest of the organization. And giving up that sense of control is not so easy. And the best CEOs often do that, right? They're quite comfortable with others telling the story, with this whole story coming up as something that the organization owns. And in fact, many of them would be happy if someone were to say, oh, we didn't know it was your story, but it's the story of the organization. And I think that is something which is truly powerful and something that we have seen work consistently time and time again.
So there's a degree of humility that comes with a CEO that is able to do that. And humility isn't necessarily a quality associated with most CEOs. How do we encourage this quality if it's so important?
I would say that increasingly CEOs realize that, there are many forms of leadership, right? And being authentic, being inclusive, being collaborative, and having the humility to admit sometimes that there may be others in the organization who may have something interesting to say or might do things better than them, and in fact, complement them makes them even more effective and more powerful than if they were to be the one person driving change. And I think increasingly CEOs have seen this. Our research continues to demonstrate this. And I think more and more CEOs are embracing this notion.
Thanks so much for listening to the McKinsey podcast. I'm Lucia Rahili.
And I'm Roberta Fasaro.
Find us on McKinsey.com. We'll have a transcript of this episode up shortly.
And download the McKinsey Insights app, where you can find this podcast and other helpful content updated daily.
If you enjoyed the show, we'd love for you to leave a rating and a review.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.